I ended up working on this project in particular, interpreting Second Peter through African American women's moral writings. One was a very logical piece, and another was a very socially responsive reason. The first is my first book was on First Peter, so Strangers to Families, Diaspora, and First Peter. So it kind of made sense that I probably should look at Second Peter to see do some work there. So it's kind of this is kind of me finishing that circle of that. But the other piece is this project was born in response to in 2020 we went into pandemic. The Society of Biblical Literature hosted a virtual event called Black Scholars Matter in August. And so they had a series of symposiums where they had Africana scholars from all over the world sitting on panels talking about the significance of Africana scholarship. I was one of those people and sat on the panel with like the first of the first. So Renita Weems was on that panel, Vincent Wimbush, Randall Bailey. I mean, these are all like the first of African American biblical interpretation. And I made a proposal on that panel that said, what would happen to biblical scholarship if we took seriously and really resourced 2,000 years of contextual interpretive work that is not held hostage or limited to the interpretive work, the cultural artifacts, the ways of knowing defined by the Greco-Roman world, defined by the Byzantine Empire, defined by the Reformation or Enlightenment, and that we really looked at other contextual ways of knowing as a resource for interpreting these texts. That essay, where I made that proposal and made that call, it birthed this project. I said, well, I said, let's do it. Let me do it. And so I ended up writing this book, which was to say, okay, these are some of the basic matters in Second Peter studies that you're always talking about. So in Second Peter studies, we're always asking, did Peter really write it? So there's always a question of authorship and pseudonymity. In Second Peter studies, you always have to reckon with the fact that this is the only letter in the entire New Testament that begins in its first verse with the matter of justice as issue. So people typically translate it as righteousness now, and a lot of mainstream English translations, it's righteousness, but that word is either righteousness or justice. And there actually is a translation history for why we now have the dominance of righteousness as opposed to justice for that. So what do you do with the translation question of righteousness and justice? Another one is, what do you do with the fact that Second Peter is like reinterpreting all this stuff? So there are three gospel witnesses of transfiguration, right? So the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have the transfiguration account, but there's actually four accounts of the transfiguration in the New Testament, and that fourth account is in Second Peter, right? On top of that, Second Peter mentions Noah, mentions Balaam, mentions the angels trafficking between God. I mean, all of these Bible traditions show up in Second Peter. And this is like main stuff that we have to deal with when we study Second Peter. What happens if you pay attention to that after paying attention to the fact that African American women in the 19th century also paid attention to the Transfiguration story? They were also interpreting and resourcing the stories of Noah and the flood. They were also trying to playing with between the language of justice and righteousness. They themselves deployed pseudonyms. Ida B. Wells had a pseudonym, Iola. Sarah Fortune had a pseudonym, Magawiska. So they're deploying the tactic of pseudonymity as well in order to write things and to be heard. So what happens when we revisit these stock topics in Second Peter, sensitized by what these 19th century African American women did? How does that give us a different perspective or understanding of how to even sort and sift the ancient record? And so this book became that kind of experiment, a sort of changing of an approach to studying a biblical text that says there's resources between these 2,000-year period that can help me revisit old topics with new questions. and new perspective.